Today on MTG Unpacked, we're going to talk about how to play Magic the Gathering. So with Dominaria coming up this weekend, the pre-release event, I think interest is high in the game, and I've had a number of comments that people would like me to do a video on how to play. So here we go. So what do you need to do to get started? We're looking at these Hazoret Aggro Challenger deck today. This will be the deck I use for the examples of actually playing the game. So I highly recommend any of these Challenger decks are pretty good. They are in the standard format, which is currently legal right now for tournament play. So we'll go through some of the cards there. If you have not seen my previous videos on the Challenger decks, you might want to go back and check those out. So they pretty much have everything you need. They also have one of these handy quick reference cards that come with them. So this will tell you about the setup, how to win, parts of a turn, and casting spells, all that other good stuff. So if you ever get confused, you can refer to this. They often include these in packs with the dual decks or with Commander or whatever else. Alright, so the objective of the game, you have two players and each player has to get the other player down to 0 life total. So each player starts off in the standard format at 20 health, and you can see over here you get a spin down die with the Hazoret Aggro and the other Challenger decks. You start off at 20, so that's what that symbol is representing. And then you have all the numbers down to 1. Obviously when you reach 0, you are out of the game and you've lost. There's another way of keeping track. You can use one of these things where you click through the totals. These are good if, for instance, you are really have a life gain deck and you're going up to 99 or 100 or more life. You can also use just regular die and group them together like that, so you start off with 20. So the resource you use to cast spells, which is what we're calling most of the cards, is called mana. So you have 5 colors. We have plains, which represents white, island blue, swamp black, mountain red, and forest is green. And you can see on the back of every magic card there's the colors there, the 5 colors of magic. So that's just something to be aware of. And then if we look at the cards themselves, I have a number of examples here. So we'll take this one for instance. So on the top left corner you have the name of the card, so this is a Tarmogoyf. You have the casting cost, which is 1 of any color mana and a forest. You have what the type of the card is, so this is a creature, subtype Lurgoyf, whatever that is. And here you have the set symbol, so which symbol the set came from. It's also colored here to indicate that it's a mythic rare, so that is like an orange red color, and we'll see some of the other rarities when we go through the other cards. You have some text here which tells you what the card does. So this is one of the things that's unique about Magic compared to a lot of other card games. A lot of the how the cards work is printed on the cards, and usually that will be enough information you need to figure out what to do. Sometimes you might have to go online if there's some interaction between different cards that's a little confusing. Sometimes they have some fun little text down here related to the card. It doesn't really have any real importance other than flavor. And then down here we have the power and toughness. So the power is how much damage this creature can do to another creature or player, and the next on the other side of the divider here is the toughness, how much damage this creature can take. So if we look at this one, Tarmogoyf's power is equal to the number of card types among cards in all graveyards, and its toughness is equal to that number plus 1. So this is probably one of the more complicated ones, but what you have here is that star is saying, okay, his power is equal to the a number of card types, 1 cards in all graveyards, and the toughness is that number +1. So we'll move on. So this is a creature. Here we have an example of a sorcery. So this one costs a single swamp, and it's also a rare because it has a yellow color. And the target player reveals his or her hand. You choose a non-land card from it. That player discards that card. You lose 2 life. Here's another example. Carnage Tyrant, 4 and 2 forests. He's 7/6, so he's a really big creature. He can deal a lot of damage and take a lot of damage. He can't be countered, which we'll talk about in a minute, how that works. He has trample and hexproof. So you'll often see these abilities. Sometimes they explain them on the cards, other times you'll have to look them up. In this case, trample is that even if another creature is blocking him, some of the damage carries through to the other player. And hexproof means you cannot cast spells on this guy, so he's pretty tough to remove. Then we have Glorybringer. So he's a 4/4 creature for 5 mana, so if you add up the total, that's known as the converted mana cost. So 3, 4, 5. He has flying and haste. Flying is pretty good because not a lot of creatures fly, and so they can't block his attacks unless they have something like reach, where they can reach up, grab him, hit him, block him, whatever. And then haste means that as soon as you put this card on the battlefield, which is what we call the play area, that means he can attack immediately. So we've got some other things here about exert. I'm not going to go through the details of that. Moving on, here's another popular card type. You'll notice it's very different from the others. This is a Planeswalker. They start off with a 4 loyalty cost, so think of this as their life total. They're treated like another player. So this is another player who is playing on your behalf if you successfully cast them. Costs 2 of any mana and 2 mountains. She's a Planeswalker. And you'll see on the left hand side here, these numbers +1, +1, -3, -7. These are referring to bumping up or bumping down this number here. So you start off with a 4, and then if you're able to cast Chandra, you can instantly do the +1, so you increase that to 5, and then what do? You exile the top card of your library. You may cast that card. If you don't, Chandra, Torch of Defiance deals 2 damage to each opponent. So casting a card is what we refer to. You spend your mana, so you have a certain amount of mana, which is your resource you have on the battlefield at any time. And if you have enough mana to cast the spell, that is the card that you have drawn, then you can cast that. Otherwise, she will deal 2 damage to each opponent. So typically Magic, you have 2 players. There's a format called Commander where you can have 4 players. So that would also deal damage to each of those other players. The other +1 ability, you can just temporarily add 2 mountains to your mana pool. So the mana pool is what we refer to with your mana. Once you've got a certain amount on the board, you can supplement that with cards like this, where it will just temporarily add more for you to cast your spells. -3 is subtracted from whatever you have here, so you might want to keep a dice handy to keep track of the loyalty there. But in this case, -3 deals 4 damage to target creature, and -7 you get an emblem. Whenever you cast a spell, this emblem deals 5 damage to target creature or player. So Planeswalkers, a little bit more complicated than a regular card, but I think they're common enough that I wanted to go through the details. Here we move on to a different type of card, so an instant. This can be played at any time, so all the creatures I showed before are pretty much, other than the Carnage Tyrant, you can attempt to play the card, but then your opponent can choose to prevent you from actually casting that card. So you attempt to cast it. If they don't have anything to stop you from getting your creature onto the battlefield, then your creature lands on the battlefield, and then it's usable to start attacking and so forth. There are exceptions there, we'll talk about that as well. In this case, let's say your opponent has disallow, so if they have 2 blue mana free and 1 of any other color, at any time, so even on your turn or on their turn, whenever they like, they can cast this, and in this case it counters the target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. So a spell is just any card basically that you're trying to cast with your mana. That includes creatures. That's something that confused me early on. So they can disallow that, and the way that works is, I'm not going to go into great detail, but there's a thing called the stack, where if you imagine you cast your card, somebody can reply to that with something else. So in this case, this would go on top of the stack, and then once everybody has built up the stack, like for instance you could even counter this if you wanted to, if you had the mana, then you work your way from the top of the stack down and work out, okay, what actually happens in the sequence. So that can get pretty complicated at times. That's something for another video. And then we move on to another type of card. We have Fraying Sanity here. This is an enchantment or a curse. So an enchantment, unlike a sorcery or instant, which just disappears, the enchantment sticks around on the battlefield just like a creature. So in this case, you can enchant a player. That could be yourself or that could be your opponent. This card, you probably more likely want to enchant your opponent. You can see the subtype is Aura Curse, so it's attached to something. The aura means sometimes you can have enchant creature, so it would be an aura attached to a particular creature. In this case it's enchanting a player, and at the beginning of each end step, enchanted player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard, where X is the number of cards put into that graveyard from anywhere this turn. And we have another instant here, Negate. This just counters the target non-creature spell, so if you try to play your creature, somebody can put this down and they've just wasted their card. But if you put something else down that is a non-creature, then they can negate the effect of your card. And let's see, we've got a couple of others here. Torrential Gearhulk, he's a common guy. Flash, this is something where he can be cast at any time, so that's not so common with creatures, but it is possible. I'm not going to go through the other details of this guy. And then this one I want to mention, Scarab God is a legendary creature. So legendary, they are fairly uncommon creatures, and there is a rule that you can only have one legendary creature of the same type on the battlefield at any time. So if you were to try to cast another one of these guys, you would have to remove either the one that's already there or the one that you have. So then let's talk about what happens after you've cast your instants or sorceries. Let's say you cast Disallow, you've spent the mana. That will then go to your graveyard. So the graveyard is the area for all the spells that are used up. You can sometimes play cards from the graveyard, but that requires a different card that tells you how to do that. We also have another area called Exile, where you would just put your card even outside the game, so it's not in the game anymore, but the graveyard is considered to be part of the game. So let's move on to the next step. So we've learned about mana, we've learned about life totals, the cards, the different types of creatures and instant sorceries, enchantments and so forth. You've got your Hazoret Aggro Challenger deck, you've got some dice. I would recommend always having a bunch of these because they're great for counters. And then the next step is to have your deck. So you put your deck down in standard format. You have a 60 card deck. The first thing you do is draw 7 cards. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so we've got 7 cards. Let's take a look at those. So I've got some lands here. we've got a desert, some mountains, we've got an instant, a creature, Chandra here, another creature. And if we look at the costs here, we can see, okay, there's a couple of creatures that are pretty cheap in terms of casting cost. We have a Fanatical Firebrand, Soulscar Mage, and then we have this instant which requires 2 mana, so a mountain and any other color. So those are common in these red decks. Red likes to get in early, play the creatures fast, do some damage. So let's get started with our turn. Before we start the game, actually, I should point out, if you're not happy with the cards you've drawn, you generally want to have a few mana sources. So you want to have, in this case, a few mountains, a desert. 3 is pretty good. 2 is sort of borderline. You might want to toss that hand back. But in that case, if you are not happy with this, you can mulligan. So that means you pretty much just shuffle your cards back into the deck, and then after you've mulliganed, you draw 1 less card. So in that case, we've drawn 7. The second time through, you would only draw 6. And if all those look good, you can start playing. If those are bad, you can even mulligan down to 5 or 4. Pretty much once you get down to maybe 3 or 4, that's the point where you're stuck playing what you have. And you might want to look at how you are shuffling. So let's get started. So first thing, the beginning of our turn, normally you would draw except at the first play of the game. So if you're the one who's starting, you would generally roll a couple of die, high, low. So if I got 7 and my opponent only got, say, 3, then I would go first. So the first player, let's say, will play a mountain. So you play 1 land on each turn. This is on the main phase. There is a second main phase. You can read the details in the quick reference card. But initially we're going to play our mountain, and then let's see, is there anything we want to cast? If there isn't, we can just say pass turn to the other player. So you just say pass. But in this case, I'm looking here, and I have a Fanatical Firebrand. So here's a Goblin Pirate, 1/1 with haste. So this is something you have to know about creatures. If they do not have haste, they have summoning sickness. They just sit there and they don't actually attack or anything. They can block on the opponent's turn, but they can't attack. So I want to play this. So how do I do that? You tap the card, so you turn it sideways, which indicates that you are using that card, and then I just play my Fanatical Firebrand. Now if the opponent, we saw that other card earlier, has negate or something, they could make sure that this doesn't resolve. So I've played my card. I usually wait a moment. If they can't do anything about that card, then it stays. We call it resolving. And in this case, he has haste, so I can attack immediately. He will do 1 damage. I turn him sideways to tap him, and he'll do 1 damage to the other player, so their life total will go down to 19, and yours will still be 20, obviously. And then you pass turn to the other player. So let's say they play their island, they haven't been able to do anything. They pretty much pass turn. Okay, so untap everything at the beginning, draw a card, and here we see I have Hazaret the Fervent. This is one of my favorite creatures in the deck. This one has indestructible and haste, so you can't kill it. You can reduce its damage down to 0, but it will not die. It'll just stick around, and then after each turn, any damage that you've accrued to a creature will be wiped out. So it will return back to a 5/4. And the only way to really get rid of these is you can exile them or prevent them from being cast in the first place. So if I tried to cast this and my opponent had negate, this would be going to the graveyard. So that's where the cards go, where they're not being played, the magic's been used up, you can't use it anymore. So in this case, Costs 4 mana. That's pretty expensive. So I'm not going to do that. Looking here, I can either play my desert or my mountain. I'm going to play my mountain as my land for the turn. And then we look at what else do we have here. So we have a lightning strike. We have a Soulscar Mage. Okay, so let's say I want to play my Soulscar Mage. He costs a single mountain, so I tap the mountain, put him onto the battlefield, and my opponent, they have no answers. Okay, so he has summoning sickness, so he can't actually attack, but he is able to block on the opponent's turn. He has the prowess or ability where he gets counters for spells you cast. I'm not going to go into detail of that. You can look that up online. But he also has, if a sorcerer you control would deal non-combat damage to a creature an opponent controls, put that many -1/-1 counters on that creature instead. Bit of a tongue twister there. So this is my turn. What else can I do? Nothing else here. And you don't always have to play. If you have a bit of a strategy, you want to hang on to something for later, you can do that. So my next turn, my opponent has nothing to block my creatures. I will attack again, so I will tap, and then it's the opponent's turn. Now what happens is if they have a creature, let's say, if we go in here, let's say they have a Scarab God here. This is not a very likely scenario, but it's possible. Let's say they have a Scarab God and you are trying to attack with this, they can block with this. So then we look at the damage. So this guy will do 1 damage to him, so he can take 5, so he goes down to 4. This guy will attack for 5, but this guy can only take 1, then he gets killed, and the opponent's card, they have blocked, so then your damage does not go through, the creature is completely destroyed. But that scenario, not likely to happen in this case with my example. So then, okay, so we've attacked for 1 again, move on to the opponent's turn, and they have their turn. Okay, they are done, pass back to me. Now I have another spell, and I also nearly forgot to untap there. So next up, let's take a look. So we have 1 mana to play our Sun-Scorched Desert. And what else can we do here? So we have 3 mana. If they had a creature, we could choose to tap our cards here and use a Braid. This will deal 3 damage to that creature. If that 3 damage will kill that creature, it goes to their opponent's graveyard. Or if it's an artifact, it will destroy it. So we could choose to do that. But in this case, I'm going to try a Lightning Strike. So pay my 2, deal 3 damage to target creature or player. And let's say they don't have anything to prevent that, to counter this spell. So then they subtract 3, so they are now down, what, they lost 1, so they're down to 16. Let's pretend that's on their side. And then your Lightning Strike is now spent, goes to the graveyard, and you're done with your turn. One other thing I forgot to mention, when you're starting the game, if you go first, you don't draw more than 7 cards, but when the opponent starts playing, they've got their 7 cards already. They will draw as you do at the beginning of each step, so at the beginning of each turn. So they'll do their draw and they'll now have 8 cards they can play with. So it can be an advantage to do that. So now I think you're getting the hang of this. It's our turn again. We untap. We draw. Now we have shock. So let's see. And we don't have any mountains to play any of these guys, so we could either do the Abrade or a shock, or we could just hang on to this if we think everything's okay. We can also attack, so if they don't have anything blocking, we can attack with multiple creatures, and that will then do 2 damage to them if they can't block it. So that's pretty much it. I'm sure I've forgotten a bunch of things. That's the general process for how you play Magic the Gathering. Leave a note in the comments if you think there's anything major I have skipped. We've talked about the types of cards, we've talked about the mana, the battlefield, how you go through the turns. Actually, one thing I need to mention, so if you have played, let's say you've attacked, you've done the damage, then you actually have a second main after combat where you can cast another spell. So it doesn't have to be an instant, it can be like a creature or something else. So let's say on my second main I want to cast Shock and shock the target creature or player for 2 damage. I can do that. That goes to the graveyard. And then you have a final end step where that's the end of your turn, and sometimes people can do stuff on your end step if they want to spend some mana at the last minute, because you can't really do much. If all your cards are tapped, you can't react. There's nothing you can do in that case. So there we have it. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, give it a thumbs up. Hit the subscribe button for more Magic the Gathering unboxings and more tutorials just like this. Leave a note in the comments if you'd like to see me talk about anything else as far as learning the game, different types of cards and so forth. And be sure to tap the notification bell to be notified as soon as new videos are released, and have a great day.